Well, good morning and welcome to Elevenses Live. I'm Kevin Williams and I'm here with my survival skills riding school program. What have we got for you today? Well, we've got a bunch of news. Bangladeshi study finds that motorcycles are the safest mode of transport during the pandemic. Kent is the UK's most dangerous place to drive. Kymco have released a rather stylish looking new electric scooter, and Kawasaki turn out to be working on a hybrid. Today's better biking tip, I will be looking at braking technique. So sit yourselves down for the next 20 to 30 minutes or so. I'll just start though by announcing what's going on over the next sort of following week in terms of my bike training. Now, we come out of lockdown, obviously, and like all bike and car trainers, I've been waiting eagerly to see what the DVSA would say, given their dubiously legitimate advice to people over the lockdown, and how bike training can go ahead under the revised tier system. And as I speak to you, nothing has yet been heard from them. Now, all except for my Kent start points are in tier 2, and the rules clearly allow me to work and for people to travel to meet me for bike training. That's my interpretation, and it's also the, as far as I know, the DIA's interpretation, Driving Instructors Association. So anywhere except Kent, then training will go ahead. Sadly, Kent is in tier 3, and travel in and out of tier 3 zones is advised against. So for the moment, I'm afraid training will not be available to riders in Kent. So I'm sorry about that. If you come down to tier 2, then we'll kick off with training again. I'll be working right through the winter. As you probably know, my COVID adapted courses now use online briefings and debriefings, which allows me to keep the practical actual road session down to sort of 2 and a bit hours. And we can run those at short notice on fine days through the winter. We start at 12 noon to give the roads a chance to dry out and any fog to clear. Right, okay, so on with the news. Bangladesh is a very crowded country. Dhaka is one of the world's most busy cities. Its streets are packed. Public transport is very crowded out there. But in a world reshaped by the COVID-19 pandemic, public transport and the sort of ride share schemes with scooters and things like that, not the most ideal mode of transport, as we all try to maintain some kind of social distancing. So mass transportation systems all across the world as well are being required to operate below capacity to allow for this social distancing. So against such a backdrop, motorcycles appear to many to be the safest mode of transport for anything other than a very short journey. And that's exactly what a study conducted by a researcher, Shayla Jamal. She's pursuing a PhD at McMaster University in Canada, and she conducted a survey of over 300 people from Dhaka, which included service holders, teachers, and general citizens, it says, from multi-sectoral socio-economic classes. So basically that means everybody. The PhD project's titled Intergenerational Perspective of Travel Behaviour, and basically what it shows is that the people that she looked at, they all thought that motorcycles were the safest mode of transportation during the pandemic. 75% of Dhaka's population, in fact, believes it's not possible to maintain social distancing whilst using public transport. And few people can afford a private car. Ride-sharing schemes aren't popular because people are worried about whether the virus is present on seats, door handles, and so on. And of course, you're also exposed to the driver. They also have a problem with the weather in Bangladesh. It can be humid, it can be very dusty, and that makes it difficult to use cycles effectively. So motorcycles and scooters have basically gained even more acceptance as a mode of transport out there than they already have. And over 80% of people believe that you can maintain social distancing and adherence to health guidelines whilst riding a motorcycle. Interestingly, the survey found that 79% of the participants believe that motorcycles are actually a relatively safe and risk-free vehicle to travel on. 84% thought they were convenient, and 69% thought they were an economic choice. Around a third of the people in the survey have actually expressed an interest in buying a motorcycle next year. So that's a significant chunk of a non-motorcycling population. Now, it'd be interesting to see what the results of a similar survey would be here in London and the other big cities across the UK. Whilst national government and local authorities are busy promoting alternatives such as walking and cycling, and obviously there's also the e-scooter trials going on in some cities in the UK, including London here, we can't lose sight of the fact that many people who work in the cities and towns actually live outside them, some by considerable distances. Now, it's hard to see how cycling is an option for anybody more than a few miles away from their workplace, and certainly, the same problem applies to things like the e-scooters, which are being trialled. In a city the size of London, you would need e-scooters spread over a huge part of the city to actually even operate within the city bounds. So you're only going to find these things in the city centre, and there'll only be any use when you're already in the city centre of making sort of short intra-city trips. Certainly not an option for riding into town. The same can be said for Boris bikes and all the other cycle rental schemes. So maybe MAG, maybe BMF should put their heads together. Maybe you should divert some of your funds towards sponsoring such a research project yourself. A properly peer-reviewed and published independent research project would carry a lot more weight, I believe, than yet another position paper written by either of those groups, which is produced internally. No matter how well argued it is, it will be the converted attempting to preach to everybody else. An independent paper, I think, has a lot more kudos. Right, okay. So don't forget, you are watching Elevenses with Kevin Williams here. I'm on for the next 15 minutes or so. Don't forget, if you have anything that you want to ask about anything I talk about in the show, any comments, I'm more than welcome to sort of answer those for you. More than happy to answer them. Any feedback, any suggestions for future items, again, drop me a line and I'll cover them as best I can. Right, good morning to Nigel, who's online, and so is Jack Hargreaves. Hi, good to see you both here. So what's the next story? Well, I'm always slightly dubious of articles which are clearly created to promote a website. And the headline of this particular article is from the Uswitch site. And basically what they're saying is that the Garden of England is the most dangerous place to drive in the UK. Now, Kent had more casualties anywhere else county-wise, almost 4,000 in the 4 years of the study. And in fact, the southeast generally is the most dangerous part of the country to drive, with 3 of the 5 local authorities recording the highest number of casualties. So just behind Kent was Essex, and then Hampshire and Surrey. Lancashire brought out was the final one in the top 5 there. One interesting factoid which came out from this study, which confounds the idea that speed is at the root of crashes, was that over half of the serious accidents recorded for this study involved a driver travelling at a speed of between 21 and 30 miles per hour. So that's not really quite what we'd expect, is it? The other interesting point was that we often assume that young drivers fill up the crash stats, and the analysis revealed that in fact the majority of accidents involve people between 24 and 55, so who were the group that we would generally consider to be the more mature drivers. Less surprising was the fact that T-junctions turned out to be the most likely location for a serious crash. 37,000 deaths or serious injuries happened at junctions over the past 5 years. So that's a fairly staggering figure, and why I keep banging on about the need to spot junctions and places, people emerge generally into the road in front of us while we're riding motorcycles. Okay. So what do we got on the rest of the show? Well, still to come, I will be talking about, I'm just trying to remember what I will be talking about. Yes, new electric scooter from Kymco. I'll just be looking at that. Kawasaki are working on a hybrid motorcycle, and we'll round off with today's better biking tip, which is about braking behavior. Now, aside from the perennial complaint that electric motorcycles don't sound like proper motorbikes, there are other issues that people have with electric bikes. We have it doesn't go far enough one. Well, okay, there is some evidence, some difficulties that we have there with range anxiety. Increasingly incorrectly, people say they're too heavy. Well, certainly the very first electric motorcycles were pretty damn weighty. They were bulky. That's changed. If you've ridden one of the most common recent Zeros, they're surprisingly light motorcycles. But one of the big objections to electric bikes has really been their looks. To be honest, a lot of them have been pretty clunky looking. The sort of kind of seats and sort of wheels and things tacked onto a battery box rather than looking like a coherent design exercise. The recent Zeros are actually not too bad looking. I quite liked the styling of the Zeros I rode last spring, but I have to say that the new fared version doesn't actually quite cut it. It does rather look like a sort of something that's had a fairing wrapped around it rather than anything that was designed to be an integral part of the bike. But the times, as Dylan observed, are changing. Take a look at this. If I get the picture up, there we go. That's a new electric scooter from Kymco. Now, Kymco have been importing into the UK for quite some time, but they've all been petrol engined up to now, and this is their first electric scooter. It's called the F9. It still won't sound like a petrol engine bike, of course, but I think the styling objection has been overcome because that is quite a sharp looking little scooter, isn't it? It's got a 9.4 kilowatt electric motor, which they say is designed for street sport riding. And it's claimed to propel the bike to around 110 kilometers per hour, which is 68 miles per hour for those of you thinking UK units. And that's actually top side of a lot of the petrol engined 125s. A lot of the imported ones struggle to reach 60. Okay, the R125 will top 70, but this won't be far behind it. So it's not a bike which is just designed for coping with 20 and 30 limits. That top speed gives you the option to run on a motorway. Actually, you won't be overtaking much, but you're certainly not going to be being flattened by all the articulated lorries as you might be on some of the slower 125s. I still wouldn't want to ride it at any distance on one of these, but at least it gives you the option of doing a short stretch of fast road. Here's the other interesting figure: 30 Newton meters of torque. Now, torque is the sort of twisting force which the back wheel generates against the road, and basically it gives you what's acceleration and the ability to drive up hills. And to put that into perspective, 30 Newton meters of torque from the K9. It's not the K9, that's the dog in Doctor Who, isn't it? It's the F9. The Honda CBR 125 puts out a maximum of 10 Newton meters of torque. So basically, you're getting 3 times as much torque from this F9 scooter. The 40 amp hour battery should be good for around about 75 miles or 120 kilometers. Obviously, you can keep topping your Honda CB125R up with fuel, but that's not a shabby range, and Kymco say that it can be fast charged in 2 hours too. So for most commuters, that should be more than enough to get to work. Certainly, if you can top up, that gives you the option for a pretty damn long commute, actually. But possibly the most interesting aspect of this F9 is its transmission, because it actually has one. Most electric motorcycles are sort of basic direct drive; they're single speed, and they rely on the engine's ability to rev to generate speed and torque. But Kymco have decided to go for a 2-speed auto transmission in this F9. Now, just as petrol engines clearly benefit from gearboxes, there's no obvious reason an electric bike can't. A gearbox is more correctly called a torque multiplier. And at the cost of a bit of added weight. The low gears offer more torque and more acceleration, but a lower top speed. High gear, fairly obviously, deliver less torque, lower acceleration, but get you to a higher top speed. So 2-speed gearbox does make some sense. The other interesting feature is that the battery is actually a stressed member and part of the chassis. Now, that's obviously been done with petrol engines for quite a while, but I don't recall seeing it being done with a motorcycle design before. So even with the transmission, the result is a fairly featherweight bike. It's 107 kilos or 235 pounds if you prefer. If there's anything missing, it does look like there's no underseat storage. It does look like if there is a bin of some sort under that solo seat, it doesn't look like it's going to be packing a helmet away. The other thing that might go against the bike is that it is a fairly small machine. It may be that the agency put a giant, enormous rider on it for the photo shoot, but they certainly did make it look a little bit tiny. But I have to say that styling there is not the sort of clunky kind of stuff that you generally see from electric scooters. Morning, Paul, by the way. Thanks for looking in. Okay, so here's a video you can watch, because this leads me neatly onto my next story. I'll just put that in there. And this is from Kawasaski. There's not a lot to see in the video, but it shows the way that Kawasaki are thinking, at least. Now, something I've been puzzling over for a while is the lack of a hybrid motorcycle, i.e. one that combines small capacity, low emissions, conventional internal combustion engine with an electric motor. We've obviously got a growing crop of fully electric bikes, but the problem with these is that when the battery meter is empty, that's the end of your ride. Even with a fast charge capacity, there will be a delay while you top up. And that's assuming that you can find a fast charge outlet, something that's far from guaranteed. I've just read last night a story about a couple who took 9 hours to drive their brand new Porsche home, 130 miles. They collected it with a 40% charge, thinking they'd be able to top up on the way back. And the article turns into a sort of a long tail of non-functioning or incompatible chargers with long queues at the few that were working. They did eventually manage to get it home, but obviously that's far from ideal, and that is a big problem that we're still looking to overcome with electric motorcycles. If you can charge at home and you're only looking to do a short ride, it's not a problem. But if you do need to refuel, as it were, that is an issue. But it goes away if you're riding a hybrid. If you have a petrol engine on board, then not only can you continue the journey, but most of them recharge the batteries on the move now. So the eco advantages are also obvious. You can do your petrol engine driving out in the sticks, but as soon as you get into the town where the pollution is more of an issue, then you can switch to your electric motor. Now, I had an experience with an electric car in California in February. It's the first time I've actually driven one. I have to say I was sold on it immediately. The torque from the electric motor was amazing. It was perfectly adequate to zip around sort of on the roads around Los Angeles. But as soon as we got out of the urban area, I was able to use the relatively small petrol engine for the long freeway hauls. It also took us up the mountains without any problem, and when we got to the top, the regenerative braking recharged the batteries on the way down. So the result overall was a fuel consumption of nearly 65 mpg, UK ones, by the way, not American gallons. And now that knocks my partner's Skoda, which isn't exactly a fuel guzzler, into a cocked hat. But not only that, it also puts my XJ6 and my Hornet into the shade as well, because neither would get close to that kind of MPG on a similar trip. So I've expressed my surprise a number of times about the fact that there's nobody looking to build a hybrid motorcycle, but Kawasaki now seem that they are looking at it. They've stated that they've no plans to build a production electric motorcycle, even though they showed a prototype, which I talked about it fairly recently, but never say never. But here's an interesting statement that came out from Masanori Inui, who's the general manager of marketing and sales. He said, addressing the contemporary issues of overall electric vehicle range and the trend for many cities across the world to declare zero emission credentials, the hybrid two-wheeler is still at an early stage, but illustrates well the diversity of Kawasaki research into emerging vehicle systems. Now, what's also emerged is a series of patent applications, and what they show is a fairly generic, let's get rid of that picture, a fairly generic sort of looking motorcycle, but what you see when you look at it is that there are two engines. There's an electric motor, and just ahead of it there is also a petrol engine. So basic, and they're relatively compact, so the overall drivetrain package is no bigger than the conventional bikes. There's also a manual transmission built in, and there are two clutches. One connects to the electric motor, the other connects to the combustion engine, and both can operate together. Now, details are sketchy at the moment, but one thing that Kawasaki say is that they want the bike to demonstrate the ability to switch between petrol and electric seamlessly. So you won't have to be pressing buttons. The vehicle will just do it for you when it deems it necessary. So that's exactly what the Audi I was doing was able to do, but can also combine electric and petrol power. Now, the thing here is that riders often don't realize how little power they're actually using to maintain speed. You need about 10 horsepower to ride on the flat at 60 miles per hour. So that's sort of CG 125 territory. What's less attractive, of course, with a small CC engine is that there's a corresponding lack of acceleration, which means the bike's fairly slow off the line, particularly if you're riding two up. And you also struggle to gain speed for overtakes, and you run out of puff going up hills. Now, if you can hitch the electric motor to the petrol engine, it should, in theory at least, be possible to take the best of both. You derive the thrust and the acceleration from the electric motor, and you get the steady cruise from the petrol engine. And this is where the 6-speed gearbox also comes in, because unlike a single-speed electric motor which runs out of torque as the revs rise, with a gearbox you can, again, the torque converter gearbox will deliver the torque from the electric motor where it's needed, which speed you're riding at. So that seems to be the route that Kawasaki are taking. There's a 4-way rocker switch being shown on the right handlebar next to the twist grip, and Kawasaki's patent says that this basically offers you a number of travel modes, which they say may include a fuel economy mode and a sporty travel mode. The throttle itself will control both the electric motor and the gas-powered one, and the ECU will determine how much power comes from each of the two sources. Interestingly, in the sort of place where you normally find the electric starter button on a motorcycle, there's a boost button. And what this apparently does is gives you several seconds of additional performance from the electric motor. So basically, that looks like the way of overcoming the problem with the acceleration from the small engine. The brake, touching the brakes turns the boost function off automatically, incidentally. So there's also a degree of rider involvement, which Kawasaki say they're keen to foster, and that's another reason for the conventional clutch lever and 6-speed transmission. I think Kawasaki could be onto a winner with this. BMW have been reportedly said to say that hybrids are too big and too heavy. But the most recent crop of electric motorcycles, as I said, no heavier than their internal combustion engine equivalents. And certainly, if you reduce the weights by adopting a smaller electric motor and a smaller battery, you can probably compensate with the extra weight of the small internal combustion engine. So it may not weigh as much as you think. My only reservation is that this design exercise uses batteries which are apparently derived from Kawasaki's trams, which are nickel metal hydride batteries, which seems to be a bit of a backward step. Right, okay, don't forget, you're watching Kevin Williams here. Good morning, Paul. I see Paul's looked in as well. With Elevenses every Wednesday and Sunday 11. You can catch up over on my YouTube channel at Survival Skills. Don't forget the UK there on the end of it, though, or you'll get taken off to someone who wants to show you how to skin rabbits or something. Okay, so the last bit for today, braking. I said I would talk briefly about braking. Now, I will run sort of this over a couple of weeks, because the article that kicked it off actually was from MotoGP, and it was Fabio Quartararo. I can never get his name right. And it was an interesting article written about his use of the rear brake to pull the bike down, to squat the bike basically, and generate extra braking force that way. That's interesting because people will read that and they'll start to think that's the right way to brake on the road too. Now, I'm going to argue the toss on that one and say he's an expert. He's riding in a very closed and controlled environment, and he is doing something that is very repetitive. He's braking in the same point at the same place at the same speed, lap after lap. We do things rather differently on the road, and the result is that braking on the road, we need a simple, straightforward technique that works reliably. And I'll look at the comparison between this rear first and front first technique, which I'm going to talk about in a moment. I'll look at that next week. So join me again next week to find out a little bit more about how the two work together. Now, the most important thing to say really at the moment is that the pace of technological development on rider aids on motorcycles has gone through the roof in the last few years. 10 years ago, when I was teaching sort of braking, I didn't have to worry too much about ABS because hardly anybody had it. If they turned up on a BMW, there was a fighting chance. If a couple of the big Hondas had ABS, but basically 10 years ago, it was only just starting to come into the mainstream. But now, virtually every motorcycle that turns up has some kind of advanced braking system. The bad news is that there are now numerous different systems. There are link brakes, there are ABS, which is fairly basic as it is on my car. There are much more sophisticated systems, which you're finding on things bikes like KTM and Ducati, where there are proportional ABS systems which work as the bike corners. Now, I can't possibly keep track of all that. I don't even, I can't ride all those systems, so I can't push them to the limit and tell you how to use them. The only thing I can do here is actually refer you to your manual and get you to read it and find out what your machine is fitted with. But an astonishing number of people who turn up to do a bike course have never actually read the manual. They know they have some kind of ABS, but they don't know how it works. So find out, that's the first thing to do. The day when I could say that's the front brake, that's the rear brake, squeeze that one harder than you tread on that one, and everything will be hunky-dory, long over. Nevertheless, whatever you have on your bike, the front brake is still the one that does most of the work, assuming you have a conventional motorcycle. So the simplest way to get effective braking is to use the front brake first and rear brake second. Because what that does is it loads up the front wheel with extra weight through the sort of weight transfer front and rear, as the rear end of the bike goes light. And what it means is you don't lock up the rear wheel too easily if you're being gentle with the rear brake. But exactly how much force you switch between front and rear does vary. And it depends on what you're riding, how you're riding it, and what you're aiming to achieve. Um, Basic trainers delivering CBT often quote the 75-25 rule. I first saw it, I think it was in one of the police roadcraft books, or certainly an article written, derived from one of those magazines, and that was donkey's years ago. The trouble is, if you try a 75% front, 25% rear hard stop on a scooter, you will lock the front wheel. I very nearly fell off a Honda Melody years ago doing exactly that. I was on my own training course as an instructor, and I was sent out to test all the various bikes that the trainees might be riding. So I sort of lined this thing up to do an emergency stop. Went through the motions of exactly how I've been taught to do the emergency stops on our 125s, and promptly locked the front wheel. I just about saved it. I discovered later that the previous instructor hadn't been quite so lucky, and he'd actually come off and broken an arm, and that's why I was there. I was replacing him. So if you've got a rear-mounted engine, then you have more weight over the rear of the bike, and the rear brake will do more work than you might expect if you're used to riding a standard motorcycle. If you've got link brakes, then the designer has taken that into account, and you will find that your front brake will apply mostly front and a bit of rear. Rear brake usually does the opposite, bit of front and mostly rear. Mix and match, and you'll get the best stopping. But one thing I will say is that the key to getting quicker over the ground is really harder later braking. That's one of the faults that riders tend to feel that they need to do if they want to pick up a bit of pace. Maybe they've been told they need to make a bit of progress, and what they tend to do is leave everything a little bit too late when they want to lose speed again. Now, you only do two things. You unsettle yourself and you unsettle the bike if you're late and hard on the brakes. Getting the brakes on well before you arrive at the hazard is always a good idea, but even more important is getting them off again. It's getting off the brakes which allows you to get back on the throttle for a corner and get the bike settled. So think about where you need to get off the brakes, not so much where you get on them. As long as you've got time to slow down, then it's where you get off the brakes, which is more important. But braking early means you don't have to brake quite as hard, obviously, but you've also got room for corrections as well. Sometimes we misjudge our braking and we find we're going a little bit quicker than we thought. Well, if you're already braking early, you're not having to brake too hard, so it's relatively straightforward to add a little bit more braking. But if you're braking to the limit already, where are you going to find that extra deceleration? It's not so easy. The other problem, of course, is that as soon as we start braking really hard, where does our attention go? Well, instead of going up down the road in front of us, it comes down onto the road surface ahead of us. We're worrying about whether the front wheel is going to grip the road surface. So we end up looking away from where we want to go. And one of the tricks, again, is getting off the brakes. Actually is one of the things that allows us to lift our vision and start looking ahead. So if we can get off the brakes early, that's always a bonus. The other thing that people kind of make a bit of a mistake about with braking is that they find it destabilizes the bike, because what they do is having braked and got the bike slowing, they just ping the front brake off. They let go of that lever very quickly, and then of course what happens is the front suspension rebounds equally quickly, and that destabilizes the bike, often just as we want to start counter steering to get the bike to change direction. So the trick is to actually come off the brake nice and progressively, so the fingers actually move off the brake just as smoothly as they would move onto it when we are braking. Okay, so if there's one thing to remember, though, on a conventional motorcycle, the front brake is your straight line stopper. So I'll finish with a couple of basic rules for using the front brake. So get the front brake on upright, then apply the rear brake. That will get the forks compressed. Remember that if you're braking very hard, you've got little suspension movement to deal with bumps. So if we're braking upright, at least the bike can bounce over the bumps in a straight line. But if we're braking into corners, then we hit bumps. Then what will happen is the wheel will tend to be kicked sideways by each bump it hits, and that will upset stability. So braking in a straight line helps the suspension as much as it can deal with bumpy road surfaces. Try to apply the front brake momentarily before applying the rear, and I'll explain why next week. Many rear wheel lockups happen when the rider applies rear brake first, because if you think about it, you've got the weight on the bike at both ends, you apply the back brake, that is using the grip against the tyre, and then all of a sudden you apply the front brake, and now you get that tilt to the front, the rear goes light, and suddenly the brake pressure that you were applying at the rear is too much. The rear lifts and loses grip and locks. We need to avoid applying brakes harshly at either end, because that is more likely to create a lockup. It'll also change the steering geometry very suddenly. Now, okay, yeah, so yes, and release the brake as smoothly as you applied it in the first place. So here's just a couple of tips for some general practice. I've overrun a bit this morning, so I'll bring things to a reasonably rapid end. Work on building your braking power progressively. Start with steady braking with fairly gentle application, and gradually build the pressure till you are braking hard. Most riders rarely get much above about 60% of the available braking force from the front wheel. On a decent surface, you can generate over 1G of braking force on a bike. Most riders actually never get above about 0.65 or 0.7G according to tests. So if you can get the back wheel in here, you're pretty much on the limit of what the bike's front tyre can do. Okay, you're not going to do that on a Gullwing perhaps, but on a sports bike it should be easy enough. So work on getting that front tyre biting the road surface. Nice, smooth, progressive application of the front brake. And don't forget the rear. A little bit of rear brake pressure helps steady the bike up too. And the other thing that I would suggest you work on is work on transitioning between braking and getting back on the throttle. A lot of riders find that surprisingly difficult. Even experienced riders struggle to go from on brake to off brake to on throttle. They try and do it all far too tight together. They probably watched MotoGP or something. But even the MotoGP riders actually feed the power back in fairly progressively after they ease the brakes off. So something you can try, a nice empty bit of car park, is just get the bike up to about 30 miles an hour and then slow down to about 10 miles per hour. So it's a sort of a jogging pace rather than a walking pace. But try winding the throttle on until you can get that nice and smooth in the car park. You're going to struggle to do it on the road where there are a lot more things asking for your attention. All right, that's enough for today. Just to wrap up the show, don't forget it's Motorcycle Live online. Today is TT Day. Milky Quail will be taking you round a lap of the TT circuit. And if you've never done a one with somebody giving you a tour of the circuit, it's well worth doing it. I did it years ago in the coach, actually round the circuit with a chap called Jeff Johnson, and it was a spectacular event, I have to say. Not quite the same watching it on telly, but Milky Quail knows his way around the circuit. Definitely worth watching. All right, okay, don't forget, I'm still here to do online coaching if you're interested. And as I said right at the top of the show, I will be back out on the road in a few days when lockdown is over, at least in my training areas, barring Kent. So thanks for tuning in. Hopefully see you on Wednesday for the next show. From Kevin Williams here. Bye for now.